You asked for a video on how to clean your airbrush, so today we're going to strip it down, clean it, and put it back together. That's coming up. Hello, everyone. My name is Daniel Reese. This is Weaver Leather Supply. Today, we're going to be taking a look at how to clean your airbrush. Now, I'm sure none of you are guilty of this, but I am notorious for taking my airbrush after I'm done with it, sitting it down, going to eat dinner or something like that, and forgetting that it's still got paint in it or that it hasn't been cleaned. And that's exactly what we're working with today. An airbrush that's been sitting with paint in it, residue, for a week. Now, before we jump into it, I know some of you use your airbrush for applying sealer. This particular video is not going to work for an airbrush that's had sealer sitting in it for a long period of time. Essentially, it turns to plastic, the sealer does. So if you're using your airbrush to apply sealer, one, you wear a mask. Two, I would suggest doing it outside. And three, clean it immediately when you're done. And I don't mean as in sit it down, go do something, come back and clean it. I mean spray it, clean it, because that stuff will solidify in your airbrush and then you got a paperweight. If you're working with dye, that's going to be a little bit easier than what I'm going to show you today because it doesn't really form, thick plastic layers like acrylic or sealer can. So with dye, you may not have to do this, but if you do, it's not too bad. The one type of paint that you never want to use in your airbrush is enamel. Between the fact that it's so hard to clean and the chemicals that are in it, I would suggest you never use enamel paint in your airbrush. Today we're working with acrylic. So the first thing that we're going to be doing today is just prepping the surface that we're going to be cleaning our airbrush on. There's a lot of tiny little parts in these things, and if you drop one and it bounces, you may never find it again. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a towel down. I like to use a white one because it's easily bleached. So I put a towel down, and that way if I drop anything, it's just going to land and stay put. The other thing that we're going to do is we're going to get a small bowl of water. This is going to act as our collection point for all the different pieces. We're going to take them off, drop them in that water so that they can be soaking while we're doing other things. Once we've got a good surface to work on, we can go ahead and start breaking the airbrush down. We're going to break it down to its component parts. So we're going to take it all the way down. And I know that might sound a little scary. It's really not. The worst part of it is just making sure you don't lose anything. So first, we're just going to start by unscrewing the back of the airbrush. Then we're going to remove that small little nut right there. That holds the needle in place. Then we're going to slide the needle out. Really careful. Sometimes they get corrosion, paint dried on them. They don't want to move. Then we're going to unscrew the retention piece. That's going to allow the entire tension assembly just to slip right out. Once that's out, we can remove the trigger. Then we're going to take that nose cone assembly off. Everything goes in the bowl of water. So we're going to set all of that aside, let it soak in that water for about 5 minutes. Now, don't worry about over soaking it. I've literally taken airbrushes and dropped them in bowls of water and let them soak for a week or two, and it hasn't hurt them. So don't worry about over soaking it, but you do want to let it soak long enough that the paint and whatever's in there will start to loosen up and break up so that we can really get all that out and get it good and clean. Easiest place to start is just to get a paper towel, kind of knot it up and shove it down in the bowl and really ream it out really good. We want to get any paint residue that's sitting in the bowl itself. Once that's done, we can grab some of our airbrush cleaner. Angelus makes a fantastic brush cleaner. It doubles as an airbrush cleaner, so we're going to use a little of that. And there's a tray in the bottom of the airbrush bowl. We're going to squirt just a little bit down in there and take a Q-tip, a cotton swab, and really clean it out really good. Take your time, get as much of it out of there as you can. If you've got dried paint in there that doesn't want to let go, you might want to grab a pair of tweezers. That can be really helpful. What you don't want to do is scratch at it and take the finish off the bowl. That's just going to mean more things in the future stick to it even harder. If you do need to get a little bit more aggressive with it and scratch at it, a toothpick is a great way to do that. You can either use the point of the toothpick or you can break it in half. It'll fray a little bit, and then you can use that to get in there and dig around. Just make sure that you don't leave any bits and pieces of that toothpick down in there because that could jam it up. Just rinse it out really good and you'll be fine. There's one more part that's left to remove off the airbrush, and it's that tiny little piece that sticks off the nose of the airbrush. Now this thing is tiny and it is easy to lose. screws. So be really careful, immediately put it in the water. One thing I'll mention is that this piece doesn't come off on every single airbrush that's out there. So the one you have, it might not come off of your airbrush, but mine, it does. So I'm gonna go ahead and take it off. That way we can clean it and really give it some special attention, because this is one of the places where you really get clogs. And one thing I'll mention real quick is you can see I'm using pliers to get this off. I'm not using it for leverage so that I can really crank on it. I'm using needle nose pliers just so I can get a hold of it. This thing is so small, it's really hard to get a grip on. So I'm using the needle nose pliers as a way to gently get a hold of this piece so that I can remove it. We're not cranking on it. If you do that, you're gonna mess things up. So just be real gentle. And now we can actually start cleaning the airbrush itself. And to do that, I'm gonna use one of these wire brushes. Now, if you don't have some of these, one, they're cheap and they're easy to get, they're pretty easy to order. And number two, in the meantime, you can probably use a pipe cleaner. It's been a while since I used one of those. Just get the smallest one you can find. If the nose of your airbrush doesn't come off like the one on mine does, you're gonna have a really hard time getting a wire brush or a pipe cleaner down in there to get it clean. So in that situation, what you wanna do is just squirt some airbrush cleaner down in there and then gently and carefully use your needle, work it back and forth, try to loosen up any blockages that may be in there. It's gonna take a little bit more time. You're gonna have to be a little bit more patient. You're gonna have to be careful not to stick yourself or bend that needle. But really in that situation, if the nose piece doesn't come off, that's really your only option. Next is gonna be the needle. We gotta get that clean too. It is one of the main points where paint likes to dry. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna use our Angelus airbrush cleaner, and we're gonna squirt a little bit of it on a napkin, and then we can work it over the needle. But pretty big word of caution here. You don't wanna work back and forth. You wanna go from the base to the tip, release, and go back to the base. So it's a base tip kind of movement. If you work it back and forth, you will eventually stab yourself, and I can promise you these needles hurt, especially when they go under your fingernails. Don't ask me how I know, because I've done that more than once. From here, we can use the needle to make sure there's no clogs or blockages in that tiny little piece. Just be careful. You don't want to stick yourself. You don't want to bend the needle. Go slow, pay attention. It'll be fine. Let's go ahead and take that tiny little nose piece, put it back on the airbrush so we don't lose it. We're just getting it finger tight. You can use your needle nose pliers if you want to, but again, we're not cranking it down. We're just using the pliers for grip. Now that we've got that done, we can move on to cleaning the nose cone. It's super simple. Grab your nose cone, squirt a little airbrush cleaner in there, grab a Q-tip, and just clean out the inside. Just takes a little elbow grease and a little bit of patience, and you should be good. Once it's clean, you can go ahead and reattach it. That way we don't lose it. Next is gonna come the part that can be a little bit frustrating. It's not hard to do. It's super simple, as long as it cooperates. So if you've never done this before, you might experience a little bit of frustration. Just be patient, it will work. So what we're doing is we're gonna put together that tension assembly that makes the trigger work. First thing that we need to do is reinsert the trigger. It's a male-female fitting. You'll know you got it right. You got it in there right when you can push down on the trigger and it bounces back when you let off on the pressure. You can't really insert it wrong. It's just that hinge that's in the middle of the trigger, it can fight you sometimes. It doesn't want to cooperate and seat correctly. It can make it a challenge, but it's not that difficult. If the video's helping, do me a favor, hit the like button. It's like a tiny little hug from me, from a stranger on the internet. Well, that just got weird. So after that comes the part that can be a little bit frustrating. Now this part right here that you see, it's either gonna be in one piece so that they're attached together, or it's gonna be in two separate pieces. And that little piece right here on the front, that piece is the part that can be so frustrating. If yours is in two separate pieces, what you need to do is you need to drop that down in there. You want the same orientation that you see on screen here. And it has to be resting up against the trigger. And then you can drop that second piece down in there. If you have one that's from Weaver or like Weaver's, it's gonna be like what you see here on screen. It's gonna be one piece. Essentially, you just need to drop it down in there, get it seated up against the trigger, and you're good to go. After that, we drop the spring on, and then we drop in the tension nut, and we're good. Now, with the tension nut, you want to tighten it all the way down. You don't have to really crank it down hard, but you do want it all the way in. And you can see that I'm using a pair of pliers here. That is just so I can get a hold of it. And just so you kind of understand how this nut works, the more you tighten it down, the more sensitive that the trigger is going to be, the less slop, the less play that there's going to be in the trigger. So you might want to play around with how tight you want to get that nut and get it down to what feels comfortable and feels right for you. Once that's back in place, we're going to add a little bit of oil to it to make sure everything moves well. Now, you can use airbrush oil or you can use 3-in-1. I've used 3-in-1 oil forever and have not noticed a difference between the two. We're just going to drop just a little bit where the trigger goes. We're going to drop a little bit where we're going to insert the needle, and we're going to put a little bit on our fingers so that we can get the needle coated really well. Now be careful. You want to go from the base to the tip because, again, we don't want to stab ourselves. So just get a light coating of oil on the needle, slide it back in, put that nut back on there, tighten it down, and then put that final cap, that final piece onto the back of the airbrush. At this point, you should have a working airbrush. If you don't, at least now you know how to disassemble it and how to look for problems. That's going to do it for this video. I will see you next week. In the meantime, go make something amazing.